Okay, now we're going to be looking at the Caged Skylark. Like always, anything language related we've highlighted in yellow, and anything structurally important we've highlighted in blue. This sonnet compares a trapped skylark, a bird known for defying stormy weather, with a human spirit trapped in a body. The title, The Caged Skylark, obviously has connotations of imprisonment, and there are many other words throughout the poem which add to the semantic field of imprisonment.
Just to really fully clarify that simile that Manley Hopkins uses, in these initial two lines, we see this comparison, and then this becomes this simile in the first two lines where he compares the Daregale skylark with man's mounting spirit, then becomes an extended metaphor that he explores throughout the rest of the poem, where he identifies what the similarities are between a caged skylark and a human with their soul confined by their body.
Yeah, and I think important to look at the Daregale, which, as it says at the bottom of the page, means storm defying. So at the very beginning of that simile, you have this very kind of strong, robust image of the bird, but that's actually contrasted at the end of the first line with it being scanted, which means reduced to. So this strong bird, which is known for defying stormy weather, is actually no more than imprisoned in a dull cage.
And obviously there's so much you could talk about here in terms of single word analysis. Daregale would perhaps emphasize the kind of the power of both the skylark and the human soul, and suggests that both are things that are kind of designed, if you like, or meant to sort of soar freely. But here, as Miss Ridley just pointed out, the skylark is in a dull cage, and again, that's something perhaps to zoom in on, this sense of not just confinement, but confinement in sort of an unattractive and uninspiring cage.
And then we move on to the second part of the simile. Man's mounting spirit in his bone house, mean house, dwells. And I think it's quite interesting that bone house is used to describe the body. I guess you've got an image perhaps of, bones appearing kind of like pillars or like prison cell bars perhaps, to make it kind of connected to the dull cage image.
And certainly the fact that he really sort of emphasizes the sort of the dullness of the bodies, the bone house, the mean house. These repetitions, or the repetition here rather of the word house, with these two sort of negative adjectives to modify that.
Yeah, and I guess interesting as well that you have the dash at the end of that after dwells, so that end stop, which is pausing, or allowing the reader to pause after dwells, is perhaps emphasizing how confined the spirit is. Like there's a kind of a barrier between physically us moving on to the next line, but also metaphorically there's a barrier of the spirit. It can't quite get past that bone house, that body.
And I think possibly the final thing to point out from these opening two lines, and the reason we're spending a long time on these two lines, is because this really sets up the extended metaphor for the rest of the poem. But the description of man's spirit as mounting, again, it's sort of wanting to soar, wanting to be free, wanting to sort of reach the heavens, and for Manley Hopkins, this would have had real religious significance. The idea of the soul wanting to ascend towards heaven, where it belongs, but being trapped and confined within the body.
Okay, moving on to the third line, we have that bird beyond the remembering his free fells, which is suggesting that bird, the skylark, the trapped skylark, is unable to remember any of the freedom it once had. And you've got that alliteration in free and fells of the F sound, which is emphasising, I think, the inability to be able to remember a time when it was free.
Yeah, perhaps. I think the use of alliteration in the poem generally is really, really interesting. And we have this contrast between the kind of the lighter alliteration in something like free fells, contrasting with, if you look in the next line, the drudgery and day labouring. and this helps emphasize, I suppose, the contrast between freedom and confinement in these two sort of strikingly different sort of sound effects, if you like, within the poem. And it's really, I think, important to remember that this is an extended metaphor. So even now, where Hopkins is talking about the bird, he is also, by implication, talking about the soul. And so, while the bird cannot remember its prior freedom, he's also suggesting that nor can the soul. It finds itself confined within this body without any recollection of a sort of prior freedom, if you like.
Yep, and then with drudgery and day labouring, as Mr. Shadell already pointed out about the alliteration, zoom in on those words. They're words you'd want to do single word analysis on. The idea of drudgery, so human life, effectively, Manly Hopkins is saying, is just full of like mundane, repetitive, grim, kind of thankless tasks, which I suppose just keep going on and on and on.
Yeah, and the idea of day labouring as well, I think, is interesting. It's just this constant cycle of day after day after day, and labouring, obviously, meaning working, but drudgery, sort of really implying a kind of a tedium, a boredom to this work, and day labouring out life's age, sort of just really getting through it, if you like. So moving on, though aloft on turf or perch or poor low stage, both sing sometimes the sweetest spells. And so here Hopkins is conceding that even though both the skylark and the soul are trapped, this doesn't completely negate their ability to sort of to aspire to something better, and in this instance he's saying both, and so that's both the skylark and the soul sing sometimes the sweetest spells. And again here we have the contrasting types of alliteration. Sweetest spells. It creates a tone, I think, that is quite light and beautiful and gentle. However, immediately he sort of follows up this more positive idea with yet both droop deadly sometimes in their cells or ring their barriers in bursts of fear or rage. So although there are these moments that are more positive, ultimately the effect overall, Hopkins says, of their confinement and of them being trapped is negative, because they droop deadly. And so there we get that contrasting sort of harsher, heavier alliteration, which really helps emphasize just how sort of miserable, I suppose, this confinement is.
And you've got the repetition of cells, which obviously links to the semantic field of imprisonment throughout the poem. So that might be something you want to zoom in on.
Yeah, as does barriers, I suppose. So this idea of confinement, again, linking back to the bone house and the cage.
Good, yeah. Okay, moving on.
I wonder if we should say just quickly about in this last line, ring their barriers in bursts of fear or rage. So I think here this is the image of both, again, just to make it really, really clear, the skylark and the human soul sort of trying to get out, to escape, and Hopkins ascribes that desire to two different negative emotions: fear or rage, so anger, obviously. And that takes us, I think, to the end of the first part of the poem. And perhaps this might be a good time to sort of talk about the structure, and the way that a sonnet is put together. So you can see here we've written that this overall is a sonnet, and this particular sonnet is broken down into an octave. So that's the first 8 lines of the 14-line poem, and subsequently a sestet, which is obviously the final 6 lines of the poem. And this bit in between, or rather the turning point between the octave and the sestet, I'm just going to write it in actually, is called the Volta, Okay, so just a little bit of technical terminology to perhaps to drop into your essay. Make sure you're using it accurately if you do use it. But it can be quite a good way to sort of pinpoint, I suppose, particular sections of the poem, and also to show your understanding that there is a change coming. Because in this first section, in the octave, really Hopkins is lamenting the confinement of the skylark and of the human soul, but in the sestet he actually moves on to a different idea, and one of greater freedom.
Yes, so not that the sweet fowl, songfowl needs no rest. So that is the Volta, the not, where it turns the shift onto freedom. And we are now suddenly being asked to think about a free bird, so a bird that isn't confined in a cage or in a cell or behind a barrier. And I think the repetition of these kind of compound words, sweet fowl and songfowl, again, like the sweeter spells, that soft S alliteration, that sibilance, is kind of creating a very soft, light-hearted, harmonious image of a bird that is free. In comparison to Drooping Deadly, it's not. You can imagine this sweet fowl kind of soaring through the sky.
And even here, Hopkins is saying that despite the freedom of this bird, which stands in contrast to the confinement of the caged skylark, but the sweet fowl, songfowl also does need rest. He's saying it's not that they don't need rest. And in fact, he then in the second line of the sestet encourages the reader, hear him, babble and drop down to his nest. So obviously the nest, I think perhaps we should have highlighted that as well, stands in contrast to the cage. A nest perhaps has slightly more positive connotations.
A home, isn't it? It's the bird's home.
It's the bird's home, yeah, exactly, rather than the sort of the involuntary confinement in a cage. And
I think the repetition of hear him is important. Because it suggests, you should be listening to this sweet, harmonious sound, and it brings joy, and it's something to kind of look out for.
And in the final line here, in this penultimate stanza, it says he really emphasised this point: his own nest, wild nest, no prison. Okay, so the own nest kind of gives a sense of almost autonomy, if you like, to the birds making this choice, and the wild nest as well. This is not a sort of man-made structure, and it's certainly no prison, which again, as Miss Ridley has alluded to before, is a recurring pattern of images in this poem, all referring to confinement and to prison. And here he's saying, well, precisely, this is no prison. This is true freedom.
And I think the adjective wild there, you could link back to kind of Daregale right at the beginning, which is this strong, robust, powerful image of the bird. And in the second stanza, which is all about freedom, the bird is able to do that.
And then moving on to the final stanza, now Hopkins returns to the sort of the other half of the simile, if you like. So this has been about the birds, and here he comes back to the human soul, the part of us, if you like, that according to Hopkins sort of survives death. And this is interesting because he states man's spirit will be flesh-bound when found at best. Now, this is referring to the afterlife, and he's saying here that actually, even when we die, and he was a religious figure and would have believed in the concepts of heaven and hell. When we die, we go to heaven, but actually, we remain within our bodies. Okay, and this is what he means when he says that man's spirit will be flesh-bound when found at best. So the best refers to the idea of heaven and the afterlife, and he's saying that our spirit, our soul, will still be flesh-bound. So at this point, we might be asking ourselves, well, what's going to change then? If it's still flesh-bound, and if the flesh of the human body is a cage, what's different at this point? And Hopkins then sort of addresses that, and he says, but uncumbered. So in other words, even though the body remains, it is no longer acting as a cage or as a barrier. And then he brings in the sort of middle of the penultimate line another sort of interesting image to help reinforce this point. And he says, "Meadow down is not distressed for a rainbow footing it, nor he for his bones risen." And this is quite a beautiful image, I think. He's saying that a meadow is not affected, is not sort of trodden down, is not
It's not affected by,
damaged by whatever a rainbow footing. So we've got to imagine the end of a rainbow, the kind of place where in sort of
your pot of gold.
You find your pot of gold. Yeah, exactly. And he's saying that it's not. It doesn't actually impact upon the grass, upon the meadow down. And in the same way, even though the human body remains, it no longer confines the soul. And that's what he's saying here in this last section. It's not distressed for a rainbow footing, nor he for his bones risen. So he here is humankind or mankind, like he for his bones risen. So the body is no longer now acting in the way that it was before, and he's saying that this will be a time of freedom. And I think uncumbered would be a word to zoom in on, certainly, this idea of the lack of confinement any longer. The rainbow, I think, is potentially also something to look at. Obviously, it's a conventionally quite beautiful,
almost
image.
Magical.
Yeah. And that's how he concludes this image. So I think, just to summarize, the key idea really here is to understand that the entire poem really is an extended metaphor in which the human body and soul are compared to a caged skylark, where the body is the cage and the soul is the skylark. Anything else to add?
No, sounds good.
Great.